the global conflict that erupted in 1939 demanded an unprecedented economic mobilization. Nations across the world found themselves facing a stark reality. Their peacetime economies were utterly unprepared for the demands of total war. The transition from civilian manufacturing to military production represented one of history's most dramatic economic shifts. In the United States, factories that once produced automobiles began churning out tanks and aircraft. Britain converted its textile mills into munitions facilities. Germany's industrial heartland refocused entirely on armament production. This wasn't simply a matter of changing what factories made, it required a complete reimagining of how economies functioned. The scale of this transformation was staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the participating nations would redirect more than half of their gross domestic product toward military purposes. Governments assumed control over production, distribution, and consumption in ways never before attempted in democratic societies. Central planning became the cornerstone of the wartime economy. In America, the War Production Board wielded extraordinary authority, determining which industries received raw materials, how much they could produce, and where their products would go. Britain established similar agencies, creating a command economy within a democratic framework. These planning boards didn't simply request cooperation, they mandated it. The automobile industry provides a striking example. In February 1942, all civilian car production in the United States ceased entirely. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had no choice but to comply. Their assembly lines were retooled for military vehicles, aircraft engines, and artillery shells. The Soviet Union, already operating under a planned economy, redirected its entire industrial base eastward, relocating thousands of factories beyond the reach of German bombers. This massive industrial migration happened within months, demonstrating the power of centralized economic control under crisis conditions. The conversion of consumer industries represents one of the era's most remarkable achievements. Companies that specialized in everyday household goods found themselves manufacturing instruments of war. Singer, famous for sewing machines, began producing pistols and bomb sights. A piano manufacturer started making aircraft wings. A toy company switched to producing compasses and binoculars for military use. This industrial metamorphosis required more than just new equipment. Workers needed retraining. Supply chains had to be reconfigured, and quality control systems designed for consumer goods had to meet military specifications. The lipstick tubes that once rolled off production lines gave way to shell casings with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Small businesses faced difficult choices. Many lacked the capital or technical expertise to convert to military production. The government established programs to help smaller firms subcontract for larger defense manufacturers, creating vast production networks that touched virtually every corner of the economy. The demand for workers reached unprecedented levels. In the United States alone, defense industries needed to fill 16 million new jobs, while simultaneously sending millions of men overseas to fight. This created an acute labor shortage that transformed the workforce. Women entered the workforce in numbers never before seen. By 1945, women held approximately 37% of all jobs in American defense industries. They operated lathes, welded ship hulls, assembled aircraft, and performed countless other tasks previously considered men's work. This shift challenged deeply held social assumptions and laid groundwork for future changes in gender roles. African Americans also found new opportunities in defense industries, though discrimination persisted. The Fair Employment Practice Committee established in 1941, attempted to combat workplace discrimination, achieving limited but meaningful progress. Migration patterns shifted dramatically as workers moved from rural areas to industrial centers, permanently altering demographic distributions. Paying for total war required massive financial resources. The United States spent approximately $300 billion between 1941 and 1945, roughly twice the entire amount the federal government had spent from its founding through 1940. Britain's expenditures reached similar proportions relative to its economy. Governments employed multiple financing strategies. War bonds became ubiquitous, marketed through sophisticated propaganda campaigns that equated purchasing bonds with patriotic duty. Movie stars toured the country promoting bond drives. Posters appeared everywhere, urging citizens to invest in victory. Taxation increased dramatically. In the United States, the income tax was transformed from a levy affecting primarily the wealthy to a mass tax reaching most working Americans. The number of Americans paying income tax increased from 4 million in 1939 to 43 million by 1945. Britain introduced pay-as-you-earn taxation, withholding taxes directly from paychecks, an innovation that would become permanent. With resources redirected to military production, civilian consumption had to be constrained. Rationing systems were implemented across participating nations, controlling everything from food to fuel to clothing. In Britain, rationing began in January 1940 and wouldn't fully end until 1954. The ration book became a symbol of the home front experience. Each family received books containing stamps or coupons for specific items. Sugar, meat, butter, coffee, gasoline, tires and shoes all fell under rationing controls. The system aimed to ensure equitable distribution while preventing hoarding and black market activity. People adapted creatively. Victory gardens proliferated with families growing vegetables in backyards, vacant lots, and even city parks. By 1943, these gardens produced approximately 40% of America's vegetables. Housewives learned to make do with less, following elaborate recipes designed to stretch scarce ingredients. Communities organized collection drives for scrap metal, rubber, and paper. Modern warfare consumed raw materials at an astonishing rate. A single battleship required 900 tons of copper. A bomber needed 1,000 pounds of aluminum. Artillery shells demanded steel, explosives, and brass casings by the millions. Securing adequate supplies of strategic materials became a critical priority. The United States faced a severe rubber shortage after Japan captured Southeast Asian rubber plantations in 1942. This crisis spurred development of synthetic rubber production. Within 2 years, America was producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, more than total natural rubber production before the conflict. Aluminum production underwent similar expansion. The lightweight metal was essential for aircraft construction. Through government investment and incentives, aluminum production increased from £287 million in 1939 to over £2 billion by 1943. New smelting plants appeared across the country, typically located near hydroelectric dams that provided cheap power. Moving materials and finished products required a massive logistics infrastructure. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial might. These mass-produced cargo vessels could be constructed in as little as 5 days, though the average was around 2 months. By 1945, over 2,700 Liberty ships had been built. Railroads carried the bulk of domestic freight, operating under government coordination to prevent bottlenecks. The Office of Defense Transportation managed rail traffic, routing shipments efficiently and preventing the chaos that had plagued rail systems during the previous global conflict. Passenger travel was restricted to prioritize military movements and essential cargo. Maritime shipping faced deadly challenges. German U-boats hunted merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic, sinking millions of tons of shipping. The convoy system, combining merchant ships with military escorts, reduced losses but couldn't eliminate them. Shipbuilding had to outpace sinking rates, a grim calculus that shaped production priorities. Agriculture faced dual pressures: produce more food while losing workers to military service and defense industries. Mechanization offered a solution. Tractor production, briefly suspended for military needs, resumed to support agricultural productivity. Fertilizer and improved seed varieties increased yields per acre. Farmers responded remarkably. Despite reduced labor, American agricultural output increased 20% during the conflict. This abundance not only fed American forces and civilians, but also supplied allies through Lend-Lease provisions. Britain, facing German submarine blockades, relied heavily on these shipments to prevent starvation. The government established price supports and subsidies to encourage production of critical crops. Regional agricultural extension services taught farmers new techniques. The paradox of abundance amid scarcity defined the home front experience. Farmers produced record harvests while consumers faced rationing. Necessity drove innovation at unprecedented speed. Technologies that might have taken decades to develop reached operational status within years or months. Radar evolved from experimental curiosity to essential military tool. Proximity fuses, combining miniature radar with explosive shells, multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness. Medical advances saved countless lives. Mass production of penicillin, developed just before the conflict began, prevented deaths from infected wounds that would have been fatal in previous wars. Blood plasma preservation and transfusion techniques improved dramatically. Psychiatric understanding of combat trauma advanced, though adequate treatment remained elusive. Computing took critical steps forward. Machines designed to calculate artillery trajectories and break enemy codes laid groundwork for the computer revolution. The British Colossus and American ENIAC represented early electronic computers. Their wartime applications foreshadowing peacetime possibilities few could imagine. Not everyone embraced economic sacrifice patriotically. Black markets flourished wherever rationing created scarcity. Counterfeit ration stamps circulated widely. Gasoline theft from military depots enriched unscrupulous operators. Meat packers sometimes diverted supplies to black market channels, where prices far exceeded official rates. Enforcement proved challenging. The Office of Price Administration employed thousands of investigators, but they couldn't monitor every transaction. Community pressure provided more effective control. Neighbors often reported suspected black market activity, viewing it as unpatriotic profiteering at the expense of soldiers overseas. Price controls themselves created incentives for evasion. When official prices fell below what markets would bear, shortages appeared and illegal transactions filled the gap. Balancing adequate supplies with controlled prices required constant adjustment, an economic juggling act that never quite achieved equilibrium. The Lend-Lease program represented an economic innovation as important as any weapons system. Beginning in March 1941, 8 months before American entry into combat, it allowed the United States to supply allied nations with military equipment, food, and raw materials without requiring immediate payment. The scale was enormous, over $50 billion in supplies by 1945. Britain received the largest share, but the Soviet Union also benefited substantially. American trucks, aircraft, food, and industrial equipment helped sustain Soviet resistance, while their economy focused on weapons production. Without this support, the Eastern Front might have collapsed. Critics argued Lend-Lease constituted an enormous subsidy to other nations. Proponents countered that supporting allies fighting common enemies served American strategic interests while avoiding direct commitment of American forces, at least initially. The program demonstrated how industrial capacity could serve as a strategic weapon independent of battlefield victories. Strategic bombing campaigns aimed to cripple enemy industrial capacity. The combined bomber offensive targeted German factories, refineries, and transportation networks. Massive raids involving hundreds of aircraft struck industrial centers throughout Germany. Similar campaigns targeted Japanese industrial cities. The effectiveness remains debated. German production actually increased through 1944 despite sustained bombing. Dispersal of factories, increased use of underground facilities, and rapid repair of damage all reduced bombing's impact. However, the campaign forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense, fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and personnel that might otherwise have been deployed on the front lines. Civilian populations bore enormous costs. The London Blitz killed tens of thousands and destroyed vast swaths of housing and commercial property. German and Japanese cities suffered far worse in later years. Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo experienced firestorms that killed tens of thousands in single nights. The economic disruption extended beyond destroyed factories to encompass the entire social fabric of targeted cities. Occupied territories became economic assets to be exploited. Germany extracted resources from conquered nations systematically. French factories produced for German needs. Ukrainian grain fed German soldiers. Romanian oil powered German tanks. This exploitation represented total war at its most brutal, entire economies subjugated to serve the occupier. Forced labor became integral to the German economy. Millions of civilians from occupied territories were compelled to work in German factories and farms. Concentration camp inmates were literally worked to death in industrial facilities. This savage system sustained German production despite labor shortages, though at costs that defy economic calculation. Japan pursued similar policies across its conquered territories. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere rhetoric masked ruthless exploitation. Resources flowed to Japan while occupied populations faced privation and forced labor. The economic logic of empire, extraction of wealth from periphery to center, reached its most extreme expression. Germany's economy had been oriented toward conflict since the mid-1930s. Rearmament began years before combat commenced, giving Germany initial advantages. However, the Nazi regime initially hesitated to fully mobilize civilian production, believing quick victories would make total economic mobilization unnecessary. After 1942, as the tide turned against Germany, economic mobilization intensified. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, rationalized production and increased efficiency dramatically. Despite Allied bombing, German armament production peaked in 1944. This remarkable achievement couldn't compensate for strategic overextension and resource shortages, particularly oil. Japan faced even more severe constraints. An island nation lacking natural resources, Japan depended on imports that Allied naval power increasingly interdicted. Shortages of steel, oil, and food crippled Japanese war production. By 1945, Japanese industry was collapsing under combined effects of resource starvation and aerial bombardment. Even as fighting continued, Allied leaders planned the post-conflict economic order. The Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944 established institutions and rules that would govern international economics for decades. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank emerged from these discussions, designed to prevent the economic chaos that followed the previous global conflict. The conference reflected American economic dominance and vision for a liberal international economic order. Fixed exchange rates tied to the dollar, which was itself backed by gold, would provide stability. International trade barriers would be reduced. Capital would flow more freely across borders. These principles shaped the remarkable economic growth of the following decades. The planning revealed tensions between economic philosophies. British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed more flexibility and support for debtor nations. American Harry Dexter White's proposals, emphasizing stability and creditor protection, largely prevailed. These debates foreshadowed ongoing tensions between economic nationalism and internationalism. The end of combat created new economic challenges. Millions of workers in defense industries would lose jobs as military production ceased. Returning soldiers needed employment. Pent-up consumer demand would strain production capacity. Economists feared a return to depression conditions once military spending ended. Demobilization happened remarkably smoothly, defying pessimistic predictions. The GI Bill provided education and housing assistance, easing veterans' transition to civilian life. Pent-up consumer demand, combined with wartime savings, fueled a consumption boom. Industries converted back to civilian production faster than anticipated. The feared post-conflict recession never materialized. Government policies facilitated transition. Tax cuts returned resources to the private sector. Price controls were gradually lifted. Government contracts were cancelled in orderly fashion to prevent panic. The Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe created export markets for American goods. These policies, combined with robust consumer demand, produced unprecedented prosperity rather than the anticipated contraction. The conflict's economic impacts extended far beyond immediate post-conflict years. American economic dominance became unassailable. The United States emerged possessing half the world's manufacturing capacity and most of its monetary gold. This hegemony shaped global economics for decades, enabling American leadership of international institutions and propagation of liberal economic principles. Europe and Asia faced massive reconstruction needs. The Marshall Plan channeled American resources into rebuilding Western Europe, creating markets for American exports while containing Soviet influence. Japan's reconstruction, guided by American occupation authorities, transformed its economy from militaristic imperialism to export-oriented manufacturing powerhouse. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower despite devastating losses. Its centrally planned economy had demonstrated effectiveness in wartime mobilization, though peacetime application would prove less successful. The ideological competition between market capitalism and planned socialism would define the Cold War era, with economic performance as key measure of success. Women's participation in the workforce declined from wartime highs but never returned to pre-conflict levels. The experience of industrial employment changed social expectations and laid groundwork for later movements toward workplace equality. Similarly, African American migration to industrial centers and experience in integrated military units contributed to civil rights progress, though discrimination persisted for decades. Technological innovations developed for military purposes found civilian applications. Jet aircraft, radar, computers, antibiotics, and nuclear power all emerged from wartime research. Government funding of research and development became accepted peacetime practice, transforming relationships between government, universities, and industry. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would later warn against had its origins in successful wartime collaboration. The wartime economy demonstrated that democratic societies could match or exceed authoritarian regimes in economic mobilization. Central planning, when necessary and temporary, proved compatible with democratic governance. Free societies, when convinced of necessity, would accept extensive government control over economic activity. The scale of economic mobilization remains unmatched. 50% of GDP directed toward military purposes. 15 million Americans employed in defense industries. Production increases measured in multiples, but rather than percentages. These achievements reflected not just economic capacity, but social cohesion and shared purpose. Yet this mobilization carried costs beyond financial calculations. Lives disrupted, communities transformed, individual freedoms curtailed. These sacrifices were borne willingly because the cause seemed existential. The willingness to subordinate personal interests to collective needs reflected both the severity of the threat and the effectiveness of government communication about what was at stake. The lessons learned shaped post-conflict policy. Keynesian economics gained acceptance. Governments would manage aggregate demand to maintain full employment. International institutions would prevent the beggar-thy-neighbor policies that had deepened the Great Depression. Investment in education, infrastructure, and research would maintain prosperity. 70 years later, the wartime economy stands as testament to what coordinated effort can achieve. When survival itself hung in balance, nations found resources and will to accomplish what had seemed impossible. The factories, workers, farmers, and planners who maintained production, while soldiers fought, deserve recognition equal to those who carried weapons. Economic mobilization won the conflict as surely as any battlefield victory. The transformation of peacetime economies into engines of military production, the wholesale redirection of labor and resources, the willing acceptance of sacrifice and hardship, these remain remarkable achievements. They remind us that economic systems are human constructs, adaptable to circumstance when necessity demands. The wartime economy functioned not through market mechanisms or government mandates alone, but through the determined efforts of millions who understood what failure would mean.